just gonna turn it on very low. It's not plugged in. Hold for extension cord. Thanks. These mixers, I tell you. Hi everyone, I'm Claire Saffitz. I am here in the NYT Cooking studio for another episode of Try This at Home. Today I'm making a recipe that I feel will become part of your regular baking rotation. It's really approachable. This is my ideal chocolate layer cake. I've made a ton of chocolate cakes in the past. Flourless cakes, devil's food, you name it, I've made it, but I didn't really have a go-to ideal chocolate layer cake. Perfect for celebrations, birthdays, or just because you feel like baking. And this is mine. I really did a super deep dive into developing this one and decided that this is my perfect chocolate cake. It's really easy to make, really fun, and super impressive. I can be an impatient baker, but it's always so frustrating when you've made your cake batter, your oven is preheated, and then you realize you didn't prep your pans. So I always make it a point to do that first. I have here 3 8-inch cake pans. Now these are 8-inch by 2-inch, so it's really important that you're baking in a cake pan that has at least 2-inch high sides. If you have one that's like a little shorter, like 1.5-inch, you're just not gonna get as sort of even and high of a rise in your layers. Room temp butter is really my fat of choice for greasing pans generally. So I'm gonna start by just brushing the bottom and sides with some of this butter. And also my oven is already on 350. Next, I'm going to line just the bottom of each pan with a round of parchment paper. I'll show you a really fun, useful technique for cutting a round of parchment to fit any size pan. I'm gonna start by actually folding it diagonally. So basically I have this folded edge here. I'm just gonna continue to fold it in half along that folded edge. And then in half again. I'm always kind of folding it along this one point. And then once I get it to a pretty thin triangle, so take the point of the parchment, you're gonna eyeball the very center of your cake pan, and then with your scissors, you're gonna cut right at the edge. And then go ahead and unfold it. And you have this sort of nice round-ish shape that is sized to fit perfectly inside your pan like that. And now I like to go in and just smooth any air bubbles. This is a pretty liquid batter, and so with a really liquid batter, sometimes you might get a little bit of batter like running underneath the parchment if it's not really flat in there, so just to minimize the chances of that. Putting that layer of parchment in the bottom just means you'll be able to unmold them super easily. You don't have to worry at all about sticking. It's just a good insurance policy. Now this chocolate cake only has cocoa powder in it, not like actual melted chocolate. And I just feel like melted chocolate sometimes firms up the texture in a way that I don't really love. And I think it can even dry out a cake a little bit. So with cocoa powder, you just get like pure, unadulterated chocolate flavor, and that's what I really love. So I have some Dutch processed cocoa powder right here. I tested a couple different versions of this, and I found that the version I liked best as far as texture was also the easiest to put together as far as mixing method. So I am using a stand mixer here. I have the paddle attachment. This is a method that is known as reverse creaming. It was, I think, sort of like popularized by Rose Levy-Berenbaum, author of the Cake Bible. It starts with your dry ingredients in the bowl instead of starting with your butter and sugar, which is how a lot of cake recipes start. If you don't have a stand mixer, you could do this with a hand mixer. It'll just take a little bit longer. Cake flour. Whenever you are kind of moderating the amount of sugar in a baking recipe, you often need to compensate by adding a little bit more salt because sugar is a flavor enhancer. So the generous amount of salt, it's not a typo, it's important. Then I'm adding baking powder and baking soda. The baking powder, that's going to help produce this nice even rise as it bakes. The baking soda, that's gonna give the cake like a super light texture. If you are an experienced baker, you might think to yourself, but sugar is not actually a dry ingredient, it's a wet ingredient, and that is true, but for this mixing method, it actually goes in with the dry. So I'm just gonna turn this on the lowest speed to combine all these ingredients. This is so crucial, but I do like to distribute that leavening a little bit in the very beginning. So the next step is called blooming the cocoa powder. The blooming refers to sort of like the way that the flavor kind of comes out and enhances. I'm using 3/4 cup of hot, freshly brewed coffee. Coffee and chocolate, match made in heaven. The coffee adds like the liquid that we need for the recipe, but also that bitterness tends to really enhance that chocolate flavor. So this is hot. You want to make sure it's hot. Add it to my cocoa powder. If your cocoa powder seems really lumpy, go ahead and sift it first, but you generally can smooth out any lumps at this stage. Already it's like so fragrant. I get this incredible chocolate aroma. And the creme fraiche adds tang, so it's not only there for flavor, but that the acid, because it is a cultured dairy product, it is gonna then react with that baking soda that I added and create this really light texture. Ditto with the coffee. Coffee is acidic, so that's gonna react. Sour cream is a great substitute. So you can go ahead and use sour cream. I wouldn't use Greek yogurt because it doesn't have as much fat. Vanilla extract. It almost has this like velvety, luxurious texture. This is a pretty egg-heavy recipe. Eggs are so important in baking. They're gonna add moisture and also structure. I'm using 5 large eggs. I'm also adding 2 extra yolks. The yolks are there for richness. It's an emulsifier, so it's keeping everything bound together. I'm whisking this together because the eggs go in as sort of the last addition. I just want it to be really well combined, especially with really fresh eggs. The white wants to like really hold together and resists kind of breaking up. Okay, so now we're gonna start mixing. The oil that I'm using is avocado oil. You just wanna use any neutral oil, half of this cocoa mixture. And I wanna mix until everything is well incorporated. All of the flour is mixed into those liquid ingredients. And then I'm gonna increase the speed and beat it until I get something that looks really homogeneous. Right now it looks a little bit like shiny, like the oil hasn't really absorbed. With reverse creaming, with this mixing method for the cake, it's not really like the more traditional mixing method where you're creaming the butter and sugar, you're adding the eggs, and then you're adding the wet and dry alternating. It's more actually about the timing, and you'll never hear me say that, like pay attention to the time and not the indicators, but there's just not a lot visually that's happening here. With reverse creaming, because we're using cake flour and because I've added all that fat first, there's really a very low risk of over mixing. You'll almost never over mix it to the point where like you're gonna then develop enough gluten to make the cake tough. It just doesn't happen with this method, which is why I really like it. My remaining cocoa mixture and my eggs. The eggs go in the second part of the mixing process, not because they have to be last, just because it starts with liquid and fat. They just go last in line. I'll turn this on and then kind of slowly work up to medium. I'm gonna continue to beat this until it's gonna be super glossy and kind of the consistency of pancake batter. Okay, this looks so good. I do think it looks sort of smoother and just more homogeneous and better combined than it did in the beginning. Even though it's a pretty liquid batter, you'll still get a little bit of unincorporated, more oily bits of flour from that first mix. And what happens is when you go to fill your pans and you scrape that into the bowl, then you get like a sort of greasy layer on top because of that unincorporated fat. So I'm just gonna scrape down and around the sides. So now we're ready to fill our pans. This is why you want your oven preheated, because we want to get these into the oven pretty quickly. I do like to weigh my batter to make sure I'm distributing it evenly between all 3 pans. So for this recipe, it's about 550 grams per cake pan. 548, 550. So I think I'm gonna put 1 up here and then 2 down below. All right, 20 minutes. Okay. Oh, it smells so good. So my 20-minute timer went off. I'm gonna rotate the pans. You can see the centers are still pretty liquid, but the top one is a little more done because it's getting that heat from the top of the oven. Oh, I'm going to rotate these 2 guys. Put this one up here. Try to be gentle. And then this guy's gonna come over. That guy will go down there. I just thought I should have put the 2 on the top. Hold on, I'm changing what I did. That was so stupid. This guy should go up here. Oh, yeah. You know what I mean? Why did I only put 1 on the top? This guy should be here, and that guy should be over there. And then this guy's in the middle. There we go. Okay, that was much smarter. Okay, sorry. Okay, that's how it should be. The timer went off. They went actually just a minute or 2 over that 30-minute mark. So this is one of those things where it's like, do look at the indicator, not just the time. I know it's done because the top is lightly cracked. It's nice and springy, and a cake tester inserted into the center comes out clean. So while those cool, we'll make the frosting. The frosting for this cake is so good. It's actually a little bit of an unusual style of buttercream. It's based on what's called German buttercream, which is where you basically cook this very like thick pudding-like mixture and whip butter into that. So that is opposed to other styles of European buttercream, which are based on meringue. So it's just this kind of like Goldilocks chocolate frosting that's like super rich, but also kind of light, not overwhelming. I'm gonna start by chopping my chocolate. Chocolate in that 60 to 65% cacao range is really ideal because it has good bitterness, it's not too bitter, and it also is more stable. Sometimes when you get into like 70% and over, it just leads to things kind of breaking and you get like fat separation, and you don't want that. Because there is so much chocolate in it, you want to use something good quality. So it's like you can find pretty decent bar chocolate at most grocery stores. Definitely pay attention to that cacao percentage. So I'm going to start by combining the milk, granulated sugar. So about half of it's going to go into there, and the other half is going to go into this medium bowl. I want to bring this up to just even the barest simmer. Swirl it once or twice as it warms up to dissolve that sugar. The cocoa there is just to add a little bit of bitterness and of course like more intense chocolate flavor to help just balance everything out. A nice generous amount of salt because it just brings out the flavor of the chocolate. It's not like it tastes noticeably salty. I'm using flour for a very specific reason. It was important to me in developing this recipe that both the cake and the frosting freeze really well. Sometimes with cake making, because it's like tied to an event, you need that flexibility of being able to freeze it. If I were to use cornstarch, what happens when you freeze something that's cornstarch based is you get like a separation, like the liquid kind of leaks out and you lose that smooth texture. The flour doesn't have that problem. So I did do a test where I froze the frosting and it freezes so well, it thawed out, I barely needed to like re-whip it at all. It just basically maintained that smooth texture. So gives you that flexibility. Now this mixture at first is really, really thick, and it's gonna seem like there's way too much of those dry ingredients to incorporate into those yolks, but just keep mixing it. It will thin out a little bit. Okay, so here is that egg mixture. It's a little lighter in color. Now I'm gonna move on to that tempering step. So tempering is where you add a little bit of a hot liquid to your egg mixture, and that is going to gradually raise the temperature so that when I put it back in the saucepan and cook it, I don't shock the eggs and they don't curdle. So I'm gonna whisk in about half of the milk mixture slowly because it is quite thick and so you wanna loosen it up a little. So I'm gonna make sure that's really thoroughly incorporated. I'm gonna whisk this back into my saucepan. So now everything is in here and I wanna cook my pudding. So I'm gonna put it over medium heat or so. I'm just gonna whisk it constantly, really also trying to get into those crevices inside the saucepan. And because we heated up that milk and then tempered the eggs, it's already pretty hot, so it shouldn't take too long to thicken. All of those bubbles will subside. It'll hold the marks of the whisk. It'll look glossy and thick. It'll just look like pudding. Now it's important in this step that we're really cooking out that flour so that it doesn't have any kind of like starchy consistency. It is thickening and it's starting to hold the marks of the whisk. So at this point, definitely don't walk away. So I'm gonna stop whisking for a couple seconds and just look for some bubbling underneath. Nope. That's what you want. So now I can take it off the heat. I'm gonna add the chopped chocolate. Fold it together just so that the chocolate gets incorporated. The heat from the pudding will gently and slowly melt the chocolate. So we'll come back here in like 5 minutes. So the pudding has been sitting for several minutes. So at the moment it looks a little crazy. It's not smooth. Doesn't look like this is gonna make a delicious frosting, but it is. Turn it on low, medium low. You'll see that melted chocolate will fully incorporate. It's gonna become nice and glossy. So we just have to let this hang out for a little bit and then we'll start making our frosting. So the pudding has cooled to room temp. You do wanna wait until this cools to room temp because if there's even a little bit of heat left in your pudding, when you go to add the butter, especially because the butter is room temp, it will just kind of melt. And that's okay. You'll get kind of a looser, thinner consistency of your frosting, and then all you have to do is kind of chill it until it firms up, but it's just easier to kind of get it all in one go. Vanilla extract, just gonna beat that in. And then I'm gonna start to add my butter, a piece or two at a time. I'm just gonna keep adding the butter, slowly blend it into your pudding base. So this is my last piece of butter. This is looking great. It is really well mixed, but I do want to scrape down the sides of the bowl. So there's some of that like pudding mixture kind of stuck around the bottom and sides. I want to just get that incorporated. Beat it once more just until it's totally smooth. Okay. So I think we're there. The frosting is like thick and spreadable and glossy and beautiful. And if you wanted to pipe this, it's like a great piping frosting. It looks so good. So now we're at the exciting part, which is assembly. My cake layers are completely cooled. They're still in the cake pans. Fortunately, they baked really pretty flat. So if your cake layers are this flat, you could just go ahead and start assembling. This one has a little bit more of a dome, so I'm gonna show you how to level that. I'm gonna start by just cutting around the sides of the pan. These pulled away from the sides of the cake pan nicely. Invert it onto my wire rack, like so. All right, so go ahead and peel that off. And now I'm going to re-invert it onto my cutting board. You could just re-invert it onto another wire rack, just anything that's flat on your work surface. So there you go. You do want to use a serrated knife. Start maybe about a ½ inch in from the edge. And then I just sort of do short little strokes. What I really focus on is keeping the knife level and flat. So once you cut into the layer, you can almost just kind of let the knife rest on that cut surface of the cake and go around as I'm also cutting through. So just make sure you're not tilting the knife this way or this way. Even if I have just a slight dome, I like to level the layers for a couple reasons. One, even a slight dome can kind of mess up your assembly. You really do want it to be flat. And two, you get to taste the cake scraps. So that's a really important part of baking. So that's just what you get as the cook. That's the first layer. I'll just show you that one more time just so you can see. Holding my knife level. For this one, I really only have to take off a very slight amount. This one honestly just baked a little bit more to one side, and that's also not uncommon if you had it on the rack where it was like off to the side. So it's gonna get like more heat from one side, set faster, the other side's gonna maybe bake a little bit taller. And then last one. Okay, I have a cake stand here. You could use a large dinner plate, a platter, or even like a cardboard cake round. That's really helpful if you want to transport the cake. So I'm gonna start by taking a little, just like teaspoon-sized dab of frosting, putting it in the center of my platter. I have 4 strips of parchment paper here that I cut. This is just useful for keeping that serving platter, cake stand, plate, whatever, clean while you're frosting. So I'm setting them on 4 sides, leaving the center open. I'm gonna take a layer and I'm gonna start by putting it cut side down. And that is because when you cut the layer to level it, you expose the crumb. And it's the crumb that when you go over it with the frosting is going to like sort of start to fall apart a little bit, and it just can mar the frosting and it gets like mixed in with the frosting and it doesn't look great. So cut side down. So now I'm gonna take about a cup of frosting and scrape it into the center of this layer and just start to smooth it in an even layer all the way to the sides. So I'm gonna go right to the edge. Okay, now the next layer is gonna go on top, and again, I'm gonna flip it over, so I'm going cut side down. So here I'm gonna make sure that it's nicely centered. Move it over a little bit. And then I'll spin it to make sure. Okay, that looks good. Then another cup on top. So same thing, just spreading this all the way to the edges. The third layer goes on top. Same thing, cut side down. Okay, that looks good. There's a step that I really recommend for most styles of layer cake, and that is something called a crumb coat. And that is where I'm gonna do a base layer of frosting across the entire surface of the cake, top and sides. That layer of frosting is gonna take any loose crumbs, like this little crumb here and this crumb here and anything on the surface, and it's gonna slick it to the side of the cake so that when we put the final layer of frosting on, I don't get any crumbs mixing in with the frosting, and I just get this like beautiful smooth finish. Another cup or so, just straight on top. I think it's best to apply the frosting to the top and then work it down the sides. The crumb coat is not a thick layer at all. It is basically as thin a layer as you can possibly make. So the cake will show through in places, and that's what you want. You just want like the barest layer of frosting. And now I can start to work it down and around the cake. This looks great. With the crumb coat, you want to chill it a little bit. So when you put this in the fridge, even for 5 minutes, what happens is that very outer layer of frosting, which is butter-based, is going to firm up and harden a little bit, and that's just going to make it easiest to apply that final layer of frosting. So I'm going to just pop this in the fridge for 5 minutes or so. I'm going to grab the cake from the fridge, the icing, it's nicely set. So as a general rule, when you are frosting a cake, it is easier to remove frosting than it is to apply more. I'm gonna basically take everything that I have left, which is still a generous amount, and put it on top, and then you can always remove it. I don't go for like a super smooth application. I like to make swirls and little divots and that kind of thing. So now that I have a really pretty even application of frosting everywhere, I can either smooth it, I can create texture. Sometimes I like to do a look that's like a little brush strokey, creating a little bit of pattern in the frosting. I just like this look because it's kind of easy. You're not going for perfection here, so it's kind of like the messier you are, the better in a sense. Sometimes I have to be told not to touch it too much because I get in a place where I just like endlessly run over the same areas, and that's not necessarily a good thing. I think once you like it, stop touching it. That said, I'm gonna go over it one more time, just around the edge to clean up the very top. Okay, I'm stopping. This should probably chill again, just for 5 minutes, a quick trip into the fridge just to set the frosting. I can slide my pieces of parchment out from under, so you get this like really beautiful finish and no frosting smears on your plate. Nothing to see. Okay, there we go. Wait, the top. Give it a, sorry. It looks so good. I think it's a really nice proportion of frosting to cake. This is what I want chocolate cake to be. It's so chocolatey, but not in a way that's overwhelming. The texture of this cake is so pleasing, and a lot of that is from the cake flour. It is so tender, but it still has like a little bit of a bounce, which I want. It's just really good. That frosting, it's rich, but it's light. It has the density of pudding, but also kind of the texture of buttercream. And it's so complimentary to the cake. It's like, I want a bite that has both. They're so good. This is my Goldilocks chocolate cake. I want it to be rich, a little fudgy, but I want it to be also light and tender. I want the frosting to be super chocolatey, but not overwhelming, not too buttery. So if you haven't made a layer cake before, I highly recommend you start with this recipe. I really do hope you try this at home. So you can find this recipe plus everything else I've made in this series and thousands more recipes at NYT Cooking.